The blood oath shattered at midnight on a Tuesday, and Adeline Dumont felt it happen from 300 miles away. She was standing behind the counter of a 24-hour diner in downtown Chicago, refilling coffee for a trucker who smelled like diesel and exhaustion, when the sensation hit her like a fist to the sternum. Not pain exactly, but an unraveling, something deep in her chest pulling apart thread by thread, the way a sweater catches on a nail and loses itself inch by inch. She grabbed the counter. The coffee pot tilted. The trucker said something she did not hear because the world had gone very quiet and very bright all at once. Then she ran. She did not stop to take off her apron. She did not collect the tips sitting in a small pile by the register. She shoved through the back door into the alley, into the cold November air that smelled like rain and asphalt, and she ran because she knew, with the absolute certainty that only someone who has spent 2 years hiding can feel, that they had found her. The blood oath was supposed to protect her. That was the entire bargain. She had gone willingly into the darkness of the Ivoryn court 3 years ago, had pressed her wrist to the ceremonial blade, had let her blood mingle with the cold marble basin in the center of the court of binding. She had made the vow in the old tongue, words she had memorized for a week beforehand, because mispronouncing a syllable in that hall could cost a person their mind, and in exchange, the court had promised her freedom, invisible to all vampire houses. Untraceable, safe 2 years ago, something had changed and she had run. Now the oath was broken, which meant her invisibility was gone, which meant every vampire with a nose and a grudge could find her in under an hour. She made it 4 blocks before a black car slid out of a side street and cut her off. She spun to run the other direction and nearly collided with a figure that had not been there a half second before. Tall, white-haired, wearing a charcoal overcoat that probably cost more than her annual salary. Standing on the rain-slicked sidewalk, with the particular stillness that no living thing ever quite managed, she swung her elbow hard at his throat. He caught her wrist without looking. His grip was absolute, not painful but utterly immovable, the way iron bars are immovable regardless of how reasonable your argument against them is. "Adeline Dumont," he said. His voice was low and precise, accented with something old and European that did not map cleanly onto any country she could name. "I am not here to harm you." "Every predator who has ever cornered someone has said exact that," she said, pulling against his grip anyway. "Let go of me." "I cannot," he said, and there was something in those 2 words that was not cruelty, but was not gentleness either. It was simply fact delivered by someone who had long ago ceased pretending that facts were negotiable. "The oath is broken. The Solvane house knows where you are. You have approximately 14 minutes before their scouts reach this street." She stopped pulling. She looked at him properly for the first time. White hair, not white the way old men went white, but white the way marble is white, luminous and without variance, worn back from a face that was all precise angles and controlled expression. His eyes were pale silver, nearly colorless in the sodium glow of the streetlights. His skin was flawless and cold-toned, and he held himself with the kind of posture that is not trained into a person, but grown into them over centuries. He was, without question, the most dangerous thing she had ever been close enough to touch. "Who are you?" she said. "Hadrian Ivoryn," he said. "Duke of the Northern Court. The oath you swore was sworn to my house." The name landed on her like cold water. She had heard it spoken exactly once, in hushed tones by the court steward who had administered her binding. He had said it the way people say the names of natural disasters after they have passed, with a mixture of residual fear and reluctant respect. She had filed it away in the category of things she hoped never to need. "The oath was broken," she said carefully. "I felt it break. Yes, your house broke it." Something moved through his expression, fast and then gone, controlled with practiced precision. "A member of my court acted without my authority or knowledge," he said. "I became aware of it 11 minutes ago. I came immediately." "Why?" He looked at her with those silver eyes for a moment that stretched. "Because the blood law governing broken oaths is very old and very clear," he said. "When a house breaks an oath of protection without just cause, the full weight of that obligation transfers to the head of that house personally. You are, as of 11 minutes ago, my responsibility, my personal charge, and the Solvane house is going to use this breach to come for you, because you know things about them that they would prefer remain buried." Adeline's mind was already 3 steps ahead. She had not survived 2 years of hiding by being slow. "They want to silence me," she said. "And your breach gives them legal standing in vampire law to come for me while your house is technically obligated to protect me, but publicly discredited by breaking the oath in the first place." Hadrian Ivoryn looked at her with an expression that was not quite surprise, but was something adjacent to it. "Yes," he said. "Precisely. This is a trap," she said, "and I'm the bait. Also, yes. You could just let them have me." "No," he said, and the word came out flat and absolute, the kind of statement that does not invite discussion. "I could not," she believed him, which was the most disturbing thing about the entire situation. 14 minutes, she said. Now 11. Then let's move. He released her wrist, and she fell into step beside him toward the black car, because running from Hadrian Ivoryn at this particular moment was the least intelligent option available, and Adeline Dumont was, above all things, intelligent. The car moved through Chicago's midnight streets with the efficiency of something that did not concern itself with traffic laws. The driver was a vampire. She could tell by the particular quality of the silence, and Hadrian sat across from her in the rear compartment with his long hands resting on his knees, watching the city move past the tinted windows with an expression of absolute calm that she found both infuriating and, against her better judgment, reassuring. "Tell me about the Solvane house," she said. "What do you already know? I know they operate out of New York. I know their lord is Casimir Solvane, who has been running illegal blood trade operations through a network of shell companies for the last decade. I know they have infiltrated 3 of the 7 great houses with informants. And I know that 2 years ago, before I ran, I found documentation proving all of it." Hadrian turned from the window and looked at her. "You have the documentation?" "I have it memorized," she said. "Every account number, every name, every date. I didn't keep physical copies, because physical copies can be taken. My mind, however, is considerably harder to confiscate." The look he gave her then was complex, and it lasted a full 3 seconds longer than his previous looks, which was enough for her to notice. "You are not what I expected," he said. "You expected a frightened human girl who stumbled into court politics by accident. Most humans who become involved with vampire courts do so by accident." "I am not most humans," she said, without heat, a simple statement of fact. "I was a financial forensics analyst before I discovered what Solvane was doing. I went to the Ivoryn court deliberately, because I had researched the great houses, and determined that yours was the one least likely to be compromised, and most likely to honor an oath. I traded information about a minor Solvane operation for my binding oath and my freedom. I intended to wait them out, and then you ran." She was quiet for a moment. The car moved through a tunnel, and the darkness was absolute for a few seconds before the light returned. "Someone in your court told Solvane I was there," she said. "I intercepted the communication. I ran before anyone could act on it. Who sent the communication?" "I don't know," she said. "I only saw the message, not the sender. But someone in the Ivoryn court is Solvane's informant, which means your house has been compromised, which means you have a problem that is considerably larger than me." Hadrian was silent for a long moment, and she watched his face cycle through something in the internal darkness behind his controlled expression. When he spoke, his voice was the same, precisely controlled, but something underneath it had shifted. 2 years, he said. "You have been carrying that knowledge for 2 years. Yes, alone. That is generally what running means. Yes, you should have come to me directly." She laughed, a short, sharp sound. "I did not know you. I knew your house, and your house was compromised. The head of a house is not automatically exempt from the corruption within it, and now?" She looked at him across the dark interior of the car. The city lights moved across his face in fragments, and she thought about what it meant that he had come to her personally, immediately, at midnight, when he had 11 minutes to do it. "Now," she said slowly, "I think you are genuinely furious that someone in your court broke the oath and sold me to Solvane. And I think you are here, partly out of obligation and partly out of something considerably more complicated than obligation." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You are very perceptive. It has kept me alive." They did not speak again until the car turned off a main road and moved down a ramp that descended beneath the city. into a space that opened up into something vast and lit with cold white light, a subterranean structure that spread beneath what she suspected was at least half a city block. Stone walls, modern reinforcement, the seamless combination of ancient architecture and contemporary security that the great houses had perfected over centuries, the Northern Court's Chicago holding. "I didn't know this existed," she said as they stepped out of the car. "That is the intention," he said, and moved ahead of her without rushing, expecting without visible expectation that she would follow. She followed, because the alternative was standing alone in an underground garage where she knew no one, and Adeline's survival instinct had always been more pragmatic than her pride. The interior of the holding was extraordinary. A series of rooms carved into what felt like bedrock, furnished with the kind of furniture that had been made by people who expected it to last indefinitely. Dark wood, deep colors, lighting calibrated to something warmer than the entry level had suggested. There were perhaps a dozen vampires visible as he led her through the main corridor, all of them marking his passage with a particular quality of attention that was not quite deference but was adjacent to it. The acknowledgement of someone in proximity to a power that is genuinely dangerous. He brought her to a room that had a solid door, good locks, a narrow window set high in the stone wall that let in a sliver of the city's ambient light, and furniture that included an actual bed with actual sheets. "You will be safe here," he said from the doorway. "The Solvane scouts cannot reach this depth. Their house has no knowledge of this location." "What about your informant?" The question landed in the room like a stone in still water. "I am going to find them tonight," Auntie said quietly, "and when I do, I will deal with them, Hadrian." She used his name without deciding to, and he registered it the way he had registered everything she said, with complete attention. "Don't underestimate what you're walking into. If Solvane has had a mole in your court long enough to have known about me 2 years ago, they are embedded deep. You cannot do this without preparation. I have been doing this for 400 years, he said. And the mole is still there, she said, not unkindly. Which suggests that 400 years of experience has not made you immune to being deceived you people you trust. The silence that followed was the longest one yet. "Get some sleep," he said finally. "Tomorrow we talk about the documentation." He pulled the door closed. She heard the lock engage, not an imprisoning click, but a protective one, the sound of something being secured against external threat rather than internal desire. She understood the difference. She sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her hands flat against her thighs and breathed. She was in the Northern Court's hidden holding in Chicago. The blood oath was broken. Casimir Solvane knew where she was. There was an informant somewhere in the court of Ivoryn, and the Duke himself had come personally to collect her at midnight with 11 minutes to spare. She lay back on the bed and stared at the carved stone ceiling and thought carefully about all of it, and somewhere in the thinking she fell asleep, which was perhaps the most honest measure of how exhausted she had been for 2 years. She woke to voices low, controlled, but carrying the edge of something heated beneath the control. She did not move. She listened through the door, which was thick but not impenetrable. Cannot expose the court to an open conflict with Solvane over a human. A voice she did not recognize, male, with a different accent from Hadrian's, sharper and more contemporary. "The court is already exposed." Hadrian's voice, unmistakably. The oath was broken. Bloodlaw does not offer us the option of pretending it was not. Send her to the council. Let them manage the obligation. The council has 3 Solvane-aligned houses on its current panel. Sending her to the council is sending her to Solvane. She is a liability, Hadrian. She knows things that make her a target, and protecting a human target from a great house puts us in direct conflict with. "I am aware," Hadrian said, and the 2 words hit with enough quiet force that the other voice stopped. "I am also aware that she did not ask to be caught in this. She made a lawful oath with this house, and the house failed her. My court's honor is not a bargaining chip. Now leave me." She heard footsteps, a door, and then quiet. She got up, washed her face in the attached bathroom, noted with detached admiration that the underground holding had full modern plumbing, and was sitting in the chair by the narrow window when Hadrian knocked. "Come in," she said. He looked, if possible, even more controlled than the night before, which meant he was working to maintain it. She was learning to read him already. which was both useful and concerning, in terms of what it implied about how much attention she was paying him. He set a cup of coffee on the small table beside her chair without being asked. She picked it up and drank, and thought that either someone had briefed him on how she took it, or he had exceptionally good instincts. "I heard some of your conversation with your advisor," she said. "I know you did." He sat in the chair across from her, unhurried. "Your assessment. He's not wrong about the strategic risk," she said, "but he's working with incomplete information because he doesn't know the scope of what I carry. If Solvain's blood trade operation is fully exposed, it doesn't just damage Solvain. It implicates the 3 aligned houses on the council, which reconfigures the entire political balance of the great houses. Your court's position improves substantially. Protecting me is not just an honorable obligation, it's strategically sound." He watched her for a long moment. "You worked this out when?" "Last night, before I slept." She set the coffee cup down. "I've had 2 years to think about the political dimensions of what I know. I've thought about them extensively." "Then you understand why Solvain wants you silenced rather than simply ignored." "Of course. What I know is a weapon. Solvain can't let a weapon that could end them simply walk around in a human body. The moment I disappeared from your court's protection 2 years ago, they had every reason to hunt me." The broken oath just moved up their timeline. "There is something else," Hadrian said, and his tone shifted by a fraction that she had already learned meant he was approaching something he found difficult. "The member of my court who broke the oath. I identified them last night." "Who?" "My court chancellor, Valdric Cessny. He has served this house for 60 years. She absorbed that. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. "How long has he been Solvain's informant?" "Based on what I found in his correspondence, at least 8 years. He was very still." "He was the one who communicated your presence to Solvain 2 years ago. He was the one who broke the oath last night deliberately to trigger the breach and expose you." "Where is he now?" Contained. A pause. "He will face court judgment." "Before the judgment," she said carefully, "you should question him thoroughly. If he has been in Solvain's network for 8 years, he knows far more than just my location. He may know the full structure of Solvain's infiltration across the great houses." Hadrian looked at her with those silver eyes, and she had the distinct sensation of being truly seen by something that had seen an extraordinary number of things across an extraordinary span of time. "You are remarkably composed," he said. "I am terrified," she said, simply and without performance. But terrified and composed are not mutually exclusive. Terror is information. I prefer to use my information rather than be used by it. Something shifted in his expression, small but unmistakable. Not the clinical appreciation of tactical competence. Something warmer and more guarded than that, something he appeared to be keeping carefully reined in. "We need to establish the full record of what you carry," he said, pulling them back to business with a precision she recognized as self-protective because she had used the same move herself many times. "Everything. Names, accounts, dates, the complete structure." "I know," she said, "but first, I want something from you." He waited. "When this is over," she said, "when Solvain is exposed and the council is restructured, and I am no longer required as bait or asset or diplomatic instrument, I want a genuine oath. Not a court oath administered by a steward. A personal oath from you, that I am free, that your house will not use what I tell you as leverage over me indefinitely, that I remain a person and not a resource." The room was very quiet. Somewhere above them, the city was waking into its November morning. "You want my word," he said. "Not the court's word, mine." "Yes." He rose from the chair, and she rose too, because sitting while he stood felt wrong in a way that had nothing to do with intimidation and everything to do with the particular gravity he carried. He was very close, closer than was strictly necessary in a room of that size, and his pale eyes were level with hers. "You have it," he said. "My word, not the court's." She held his gaze. "Then let's get to work." They spent 6 hours in a room with a long table and 2 court archivists that Hadrian trusted personally, and Adeline talked. She talked with the organized precision of someone who had spent 2 years rehearsing this moment in the back of her mind, laying out Solvain's blood trade network the way she would have laid out a forensic audit. Structured and sourced and cross-referenced, she named 37 shell companies. She named 11 council-adjacent figures whose finances mapped to Solvane payments. She described the mechanism by which Solvane had been extracting blood from unwilling human donors, processing it and selling it through luxury channels to houses that preferred not to ask questions about supply chains. Hadrian sat at the far end of the table and did not speak much. He watched her work with an attention that she felt as a physical thing, warm and unwavering, and the archivists wrote rapidly in the old script that the great houses used for sensitive documentation. And by the time she finished, her throat was dry, and the morning had become afternoon. "That," said one of the archivists, a compact woman with copper hair, and the careful manner of someone accustomed to handling volatile information, "is enough to end the Solvane house entirely." "That is the intention," Adeline said. Hadrian rose and came to her end of the table and set a fresh glass of water beside her without ceremony, and she drank it, and for a moment their hands were very close on the table surface, close enough that she was aware of the temperature difference between them, his skin cool and hers warm, and neither of them moved. "Thank you," he said quietly, "just her." "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Getting the information and deploying it safely are two different problems, I know." He straightened. "We go to the High Council in 3 days. I have enough allies to secure a proper panel, Solvane-free. But the presentation must be impeccable." "I'll present it myself," she said. "The High Council does not typically receive testimony from humans." "Then the High Council can adapt," she said. "Or it can spend another decade pretending the blood trade doesn't exist. I'm not hiding behind intermediaries. I found this information. I preserved it. I will deliver it." There was a beat of silence. The archivist made a small sound that might have been admiration. Hadrian's expression was the most unguarded she had seen it yet. "I will arrange it," he said. She was moved to a larger set of rooms that afternoon, connected to the main corridor of the holding by a guarded passage. Her door was no longer locked from the outside. She noted this. She noted also that Hadrian's own quarters were adjacent, a fact she deduced from the late-night sounds of movement and the slim line of light visible under the connecting wall. He was not sleeping. She was not entirely surprised. On the second evening, she heard raised voices in the corridor and opened her door to find 3 of Hadrian's court members in a heated exchange, 2 of them arguing that she was too dangerous to keep, that her presence was drawing Solvane attention to the holding, that she should be handed to the council immediately. The third was silent, watching, and she could not read his expression. Hadrian was there before she had fully processed the scene, stepping out of his room and into the corridor with a quiet speed that turned 3 raised voices into immediate silence. "She is under my personal oath," he said, the same flat absolute tone she had heard before, the one that was not anger but was considerably more dangerous than anger. "The next member of this court who suggests compromising that oath will answer to me personally. Are we clear?" The 2 arguing vampires looked at each other, and then at the floor, and then retreated. The third one looked at Hadrian for a long moment, and then looked at Adeline, and she read his expression now. It was calculating. She filed it away. When the corridor had cleared, she said to Hadrian, the third one, the silent one, "Mordecai Velthan," he said, following her back toward her doorway. "Court strategist. Is he trustworthy?" "He has been. Until tonight, I would have said without question. Watch him," she said. "He is deciding something." Hadrian looked at her with an expression that was becoming familiar. That combination of wariness and something softer that she had learned meant he was allowing himself to trust her judgment, which she understood from his perspective was a significant concession. "I will," he said. He did not leave immediately. He stood in her doorway with his hands at his sides, and the light from the corridor behind him made his white hair incandescent, and she was abruptly and inconveniently aware of how long it had been since she had stood close to someone she was not afraid of. "You should sleep," he said. "So should you," she said. "I don't require sleep the way you do." "That's not what I meant," she said quietly. "You've been awake for at least 36 hours. Even 400 years of endurance has a cost. Stop punishing yourself for what Valdric did." The silence that followed was the most complete one yet, and it lasted long enough that she wondered if she had miscalculated. Then he said, very quietly, "You see too much occupational habit," she said. "Forensic analysts see patterns. You're a pattern." "What pattern do I make?" She considered him. A man who built a court around a code of honor, she said, and takes every breach of that code as a personal failing, even the ones that were not his fault, even the ones caused by people who decided to betray him for reasons that have nothing to do with him. You blame yourself for Valdric because you trusted him. But trust is not failure. Being betrayed is not the same as being wrong. He was very still. It is the same in consequence, he said. No, she said, it isn't. The consequence of betrayal is that you have to rebuild from the breach. But rebuilding from honest trust that was exploited is different from rebuilding from naive neglect. You were not negligent. Someone worked very hard for 8 years to deceive you. Give yourself the distinction. His jaw moved. His eyes were doing something complicated. He looked away and then back, and when he looked back, there was a quality in his expression that she thought might be the real thing beneath all the control. Something old and tired and not resigned but worn. I will consider your argument, he said. High praise, she said. A sound that might have been a laugh moved through him, brief and unpracticed, as if laughter was not something he used regularly. She found it disproportionately affecting. Sleep, she said again gently. Good night, Adeline, he said. Good night, Hadrian. He moved away down the corridor, and she closed her door and leaned her back against it in the dark, and allowed herself a single moment of complete honesty about what was happening to her. Then she went to sleep, because she had 3 days to prepare to bring down one of the most powerful vampire houses in the world, and sentiment, however inconvenient and real, was a second priority item. On the third morning, Mordecai Velthan tried to move her. She was in the records room reviewing the documentation that the archivists had compiled from her account, annotating where additional context would strengthen the council presentation, when the door opened and Velthan entered with 2 court guards she did not recognize. The Duke has authorized your transfer to an upper holding, Velthan said. His voice was smooth and practiced. For security reasons. She did not move from her chair. Hadrian told me himself this morning that I would remain here until council day, she said. He would have communicated a change through the archivist, not through you. Velthan's expression did not change. Plans have changed. Show me the authorization, she said. In his handwriting with his seal. A pause that was 1 second too long, she stood up. Where is Hadrian? He is occupied with court matters. She moved toward the door, and one of the guards stepped into her path, and that was confirmation enough. She grabbed the heavy seal stamp from the record table, a solid brass thing the size of a hand, and threw it hard at the light strip panel on the wall. The Underground Holdings emergency protocol, which she had quietly researched during her second day here, responded to unexpected electrical disruption by broadcasting an alarm throughout the complex. The alarm went off. Velthan grabbed her arm. She drove her elbow back into his chest with every ounce of force she had, which was not a vampire's force, but was enough to make him lose his grip. And then she was running for the door, shouting Hadrian's name with the full volume of her lungs, which were considerably more functional than Velthan had apparently anticipated. Hadrian arrived in under 20 seconds. He came down the corridor at a speed that human eyes could barely track, and the quality of his presence when he arrived, white-faced with something that was not fear but was fear's superior cousin, filled the corridor entirely. He took in the scene, Velthan, the unfamiliar guards, Adeline backed against the far wall, with the door to the records room between her and them. Adeline, he said, not a question. He tried to move me, she said. Without your authorization, the guards are not court-registered. I don't recognize their insignia. Hadrian looked at Velthan for exactly 3 seconds, and whatever was in that look made one of the unfamiliar guards start moving for the corridor exit. The other Ivoryn court members, who had arrived with Hadrian, cut them off without being instructed to do so. Mordecai Velthan, Hadrian said, and his voice had dropped to something very soft, which she was learning was considerably more dangerous than volume. You will explain yourself. Completely now. Velthan looked at the floor, the guards, the walls, everywhere but at Hadrian's face. Then his shoulders dropped in the particular way of someone whose calculation and one has come out wrong, and who has decided that the calculation is over. Solvain found the holding, Velthan said. Casimir promised the court's strategic position would be protected if we delivered her before the council hearing. He has 3 great houses behind him. You cannot win this, Hadrian. You were going to lose her anyway. You fool, Hadrian said. Quietly, quietly. Casimir Solvane does not protect, he collects. And you have just told him that this court's loyalty can be bought, which means he will never trust this court and will work to dismantle it at the first opportunity. Velthan looked up. Something in his expression broke. He had not, she thought, fully thought it through. He had panicked and made a deal that felt like survival and was actually something else entirely. The guards, Hadrian said, turning to his court members. Solvane's people? Yes, said one of the court members, who had checked the insignia. Outer ring scouts, contain them. He turned to Velthan. You will answer to court judgment alongside Valdric. A pause. Take him. When the corridor had cleared and they were briefly alone, Adeline crossed to Hadrian and stood in front of him, and she could see very clearly the cost of this moment on his face, because it was no longer just one traitor. It was two members of a court he had led for centuries, sold to his enemy, and she thought about what that felt like from inside 400 years of responsibility, and did not try to minimize it. This means Solvane knows where the holding is, she said. Yes, how long before he moves on it? Hours, perhaps less. Then we move first, she said. We go to the council today, not in 3 days, today. We walk in with what we have, and we don't give Solvane time to regroup after losing his scouts. Hadrian looked at her. The presentation is not complete. It is complete enough, she said. A partial case presented before the story changes is better than a perfect case presented after we're dead. He studied her face for a long particular moment. She held his gaze, and she felt the weight of his attention as something real, something that mattered in ways she was not fully cataloguing. You're right, he said. I know, she said. Let's go. They moved the entire holding in under an hour. The High Council of the Great Houses convened in a space beneath Manhattan. A chamber of black stone and cold light that had been in continuous use for 3 centuries, predating the buildings above it by decades. The access was through a door in a parking structure off Fifth Avenue, behind a panel that required a specific frequency of pressure to open, and Adeline committed the entire route to memory as she walked it. There were 16 vampires in the council chamber when Hadrian entered, and the shift in atmosphere that attended his arrival was immediate and significant. He walked into that room the way someone walks into a space they have never been uncertain about, which she thought took particular kind of courage from someone who had just discovered 2 traitors in his own court within 48 hours. He did not show the damage. He wore it like the charcoal overcoat, as something that belonged to him and could not be weaponized against him by being visible. She walked in beside him, and the shift in atmosphere became more significant still, because a human walking into the High Council chamber beside the Duke of the Northern Court was not a thing that happened. Casimir Solvane was at the far end of the chamber. She had never seen him before. She had read everything about him, had reconstructed his financial architecture from documentation alone, but this was the first time she had looked at him in a room. He was old in the way all old vampires are old, not decrepit but arrested, preserved at an age that suggested maturity without suggesting time, with dark hair, silver, at the temples and eyes the color of something that had once been warm, and was no longer. He looked at her with an expression of calculated composure, and she thought, clearly and coldly, that he was afraid. Good the council chair, an ancient woman named Lyris Dravine, who had been administering great house law for longer than most buildings stood, looked at Hadrian with an expression of measured attention. Duke Ivoryn, she said. This session was not scheduled. I invoked emergency standing under Blood Law Article 7, Hadrian said. A great house has violated the terms of a lawful binding oath. The breach is documented, the consequences are active, the council's duty is to convene. Lyris Dravine looked at Adeline. This is Adeline Dumont, Hadrian said, the protected party under the breached oath. She has testimony that supersedes the oath violation in its relevance to great house conduct. With the council's permission, she will present it directly. The council does not typically, began one of the Solvane-aligned members, a narrow-faced vampire, whose name she did not know, but whose accounts she absolutely did. The council will hear her, said Lyris Dravine, and her voice was the kind of voice that ends sentences. Given the circumstances under which this session has been called, the standard protocols are suspended. Speak, Miss Dumont. She stepped forward. She was aware of Casimir Solvane watching her from the far end of the chamber. She was aware of Hadrian standing 2 steps behind, and to her right, a steady and immovable presence at her back. She thought about 2 years in hiding. She thought about the trucker's coffee going cold while she ran. She thought about the blood oath, and how it had felt when it broke, that unraveling in her chest, and how she had been afraid, and had run toward the danger rather than away from it, because the danger was knowable and the alternative was indefinite, exhausting, lonely hiding. She presented the case. She was precise, structured, relentless. She named Casimir Solvane's operation from its founding date to its current reach. She named the 11 council-adjacent figures whose finances showed Solvane payments, and 3 of them were in this room, and she looked at each of them as she named them. She described the blood trade mechanism, the supply chain, the shell companies, the human victims. She laid it out the way she had laid it out for the archivists. But here she added the political dimension. The 3 great houses that had been maneuvered into alignment with Solvane, the way that alignment had corrupted the council's oversight function, and what the total cost of that corruption had been across a decade. It took 40 minutes. The chamber was completely silent throughout. When she finished, Lyris Dravine was quiet for a long moment. Then Casimir Solvane stood. "This is a fabrication," he said. His voice was very controlled. "This human has been used by the Ivoryn court to manufacture a political attack." "The account numbers," said one of the council members. "A woman with copper-grey hair, who had been writing throughout the presentation, are verifiable. I recognize several of these structures from regulatory filings I have reviewed. This is not a fabrication." Solvane looked at the woman. Something in his expression shifted from composure to calculation. "Mira, don't," said Mira Vayan, and her voice was flat. "Casimir, don't." A second council member stood, then a third. The 3 Solvane-aligned members looked at each other across the chamber, and Adeline watched the calculation happen in real time. 3 vampires deciding whether the math still worked. The math did not still work. One of them sat down. The other 2 followed. What happened after that was the particular kind of vampire court process that moved with the deliberate momentum of something unstoppable once begun. The documentation was entered into the council record. The 3 implicated council members were immediately suspended, pending investigation. An emergency panel of 6 unaffiliated Great House representatives was convened within the hour to take temporary oversight of the council's functions. Casimir Solvane was detained by council enforcement before he reached the door. He looked at Adeline as they took him from the chamber, and she met his gaze without flinching. And she thought about what it meant, that all of this had started with a woman who worked in forensic finance, deciding that she could not simply pretend she had not seen what she had seen. She had not been wrong. In the corridor outside the chamber, in the brief space before the follow-up session began, Hadrian found her against the wall with her arms folded and her eyes closed, not from fear, but from the particular exhaustion of sustained precision. "Adeline," he said. She opened her eyes. He was very close, closer than the corridor required, and his expression was the most unguarded she had seen it. "You were extraordinary in there," he said. "I was prepared," she said. "There is a difference between prepared and extraordinary," he said. "You navigated 3 simultaneous political alignments in real time. You rid the room and adjusted your presentation without losing your structure. You knew exactly which names would pivot which votes." "I spent 2 years thinking about it," she said, but her voice was quieter than she intended. "You spent 2 years alone," he said, "carrying an impossible weight, making impossible decisions. Staying invisible when invisibility was the only option, and then walking into the most dangerous room in vampire politics when you had to. You did that, not the court you." She looked at him. The corridor was stone and cold light, and somewhere above them New York was doing its relentless November thing, and the man in front of her was 400 years old and had come for her at midnight with 11 minutes to spare, and had given her his word, his personal word, without hesitation. "I had help," she said. "For the first time in 2 years I had help." His hand moved, slowly and with deliberate care, and his fingers closed around hers where her arms were folded, not pulling, just closing, cool and certain. "You will always have it now," he said. "I gave you my word. You gave me your word that I was free," she said. That's different from what you're implying. Yes, he said, it is. He looked at her with those silver eyes that had been seeing the world for 4 centuries, and for once they were not controlled or careful or tactical. They were simply looking at her with the particular quality of someone who has stopped working against something and started allowing it. The oath I gave you was your freedom. What I am offering now is my choice, my preference, mine, not the court's. She thought about 2 years of running. She thought about every calculation, every careful move. Every night, she had watched the door of whatever temporary room she was in and wondered how long the quiet would hold. She thought about what it felt like when the oath broke, that unraveling, and how the fear had come first, and then, underneath it, something almost like relief, because at least it was moving, at least it was real, at least she was not simply waiting anymore. You barely know me, she said. I know you considerably better than most people I have spent decades with, he said. You see that. She did see that. This is not a strategic alliance, she said. Not an asset protection arrangement. No, not political. It would be considerably more convenient if it were, he said, with a dry quality that was almost humor. The Duke of the Northern Court developing a preference for the human woman who just restructured the great house political balance is not, in fact, the strategically simple option. She laughed, a real one, startled out of her, and it surprised them both. His expression shifted into something that was entirely unguarded, that briefly open looks of someone witnessing something that matters. Adeline, he said. I know, she said. She turned her hand so that instead of him holding her folded arms, they were simply holding hands, which felt completely different and was probably obvious to anyone who walked past them. I know, I am also not choosing the simple option. His fingers tightened around hers. The second session begins in 20 minutes, he said. I know, we should go back in. In a moment, she said, and they stayed where they were for a few moments more in the corridor, holding hands like the most uncomplicated thing in the world, and then they went back in together. The restructuring of the Great House Council took 3 weeks. Adeline stayed in Chicago during most of it, in the underground holding, but her role shifted as the weeks moved. She was no longer a protected party awaiting tribunal. She was a consultant, a witness, a source of information that the emergency panel needed repeatedly as they worked through the full scope of Solvain's operation. She had meetings with 3 different sets of council representatives. She provided her full account in depositions that lasted full days, and that she delivered with the same sincere precision she had brought to the initial presentation. She also, in the evenings, ate dinner with Hadrian. This was not strategic. This was not political. This was simply what happened when 2 people are in the same space for weeks, and one of them makes coffee without being asked, and the other stays in the doorway rather than leaving immediately and eventually staying for dinner, is simply the natural next thing. He told her about the 400 years in fragments that were not reminiscing but were answering questions, because she asked questions the way she did everything, carefully and with genuine interest, and he answered them with a carefulness that she understood was not usual for him, not the precision of strategy, but the precision of someone who is not accustomed to being asked things for the simple reason of curiosity rather than agenda. She learned that he had built the Northern Court from a small territorial holding into one of the great houses over the course of 2 centuries, that he had done it through a combination of genuine military strength and an absolute refusal to use blood trade or forced extraction, that the code of honor the court was known for was not a performance but a standard he had held through situations where abandoning it would have been significantly easier and more profitable. She told him about her life before Solvain, about the forensic finance career, about the moment she had been auditing a luxury import company and had found a discrepancy that led to another discrepancy that led to a financial structure that could only be explained by one thing, and how she had spent 3 weeks convincing herself she was wrong before she accepted that she was right. You could have gone to human law enforcement, he said one evening. They were at the table in the small dining space of the holding, and the city was a distant murmur somewhere far above, and the light was warm and amber. She had found that she was almost comfortable in this underground space, which surprised her. Human law enforcement doesn't have jurisdiction over great house operations, she said, and any evidence I gave them would have been compromised or disappeared before it reached anyone relevant. Solvane has people in human institutions too. The only authority with actual jurisdiction was the High Council. She looked at him. I needed a great house to take me to the council. I researched the houses and chose yours. You chose well, he said. I had to, she said. I only had one choice. Why mine, specifically? She had wondered, sitting in the cold of various hiding places over 2 years, whether she had chosen correctly, whether another house would have been better or faster or safer. She had always come back to the same answer. Your court had never used blood trade, she said. Not once in its recorded history. Every other great house has at least a period of it, a time when they found justifications. Yours didn't. I thought that meant either the records were falsified or the standard was genuine. I determined the records were accurate. How? Cross-referencing human financial records from the regions your court controlled over time. Blood trade operations leave economic patterns, population displacement, specific mortality rates in particular communities, certain kinds of financial flows. Your territories didn't show those patterns. So either your records were accurate, or you had somehow run an illegal operation for 4 centuries without leaving a single economic fingerprint, which is frankly impossible. He was quiet for a moment. You verified my court's honor through financial forensics, he said. I needed to trust someone, she said. I needed a reason to trust someone, so I found one. And now? She looked at him across the table. He was backlit by the warm amber light, and his white hair was down from its usual arrangement, loose at his jaw, and his expression was the one she had come to think of as his real one, the one underneath all the control, the one she suspected very few people had seen. Now I don't need the financial records, she said. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he reached across the table, and his hand covered hers, and she turned her hand over, and they sat like that for a while without speaking. And it was the quietest and most comfortable she had been in longer than she could clearly remember. On the 18th day, Casimir Solvane was formally tried before the restructured council and found in breach of 11 blood laws, 7 interhouse treaties, and 3 ancient vows that dated to the founding period of the great houses themselves. The Solvane house was dissolved, its territories redistributed, its members given 60 days to present themselves to the appropriate regional houses for individual processing. The 3 implicated council members were stripped of their seats. The informants in the other great houses were identified through the documentation, because Adeline's account had named enough of them to allow the investigators to pull threads, and when threads were pulled, the network unraveled faster than even she had expected, because that is what happens when you build a structure on forced silence and someone finally speaks. Valdric Cessny and Mordecai Velthan were tried under Northern court law and stripped of their positions. Valdric's sentence was severe. Mordecai's was tempered by the fact that he had been in genuine fear, had panicked rather than committed to ideology, and had not ultimately acted because Adeline had sounded the alarm first. He was placed under strict supervision and removed from any court function with access to protected parties. Adeline presented her final deposition to the emergency panel on the 21st day and walked out of the hearing room into the corridor to find Hadrian waiting. He fell into step without preamble. It's done, she said. Yes. Solvane is dissolved. Yes. The council is restructured. The emergency panel will operate for another 6 months before permanent seats are elected, he said. But yes, the structure is sound. She stopped in the corridor. He stopped a half step later and turned to look at her. My oath, she said. The one you gave me. I'm free. You were always going to be free, he said. The oath was a formality. My word is not. I know. She looked at him. I want to talk about what comes next. Yes, he said. So do I. They went back to Chicago to the underground holding, because the formal processes still required another few days of documentation, and Chicago was the Northern Court's primary continental holding. She was in the small sitting room when he came to find her that evening, and he stood in the doorway in his charcoal overcoat and his white hair and his 400 years. And he looked at her with an expression that had nothing controlled about it at all. I want to be very clear with you, he said, about what I am and am not able to offer. Then be clear, she said. I am a vampire, he said. I am 400 years old. I have a court to run and obligations that are centuries deep. My life is conducted at a different speed and scale from a human life. I have watched people I cared for age and die, more times than I prefer to enumerate, and I am honest enough to tell you that it has left marks on me that do not simply resolve. He held her gaze. I am telling you this not to discourage you, but because you are someone who makes decisions based on accurate information, and you deserve accurate information. She stood up. She crossed the room to where he stood in the doorway, and she looked up at him because he was taller than her by enough to matter, and she said, I know what you are. I researched you before I ever chose your court. I know you have watched people die. I know your life is not a human life. I am a forensic analyst. I am someone who looks at the full picture and makes the call based on evidence. She held his gaze. The evidence suggests that you came for me at midnight with 11 minutes to spare. That you gave me your word without a second of hesitation. That you sat in a hearing room for 6 hours while I dismantled an empire you helped dismantle. And you looked at me like I was doing the most remarkable thing you had witnessed in 4 centuries. That you have been the safest thing in my vicinity since the moment I met you. She paused. Sartased. I am choosing this with full information. That is what I do. He moved, and it was the same controlled quickness that she had seen in that first the Chicago alley, but this time it brought his hands to her face, and his touch was cool and precise and gentle in the way that things are gentle when they are being very careful with something they do not want to damage. You are the most remarkable person I have encountered in 400 years, he said, and it was not a compliment in the flattering sense, but in the truest sense, stated simply and with the weight of 4 centuries behind it. I know, she said and smiled. Now stop being so measured about it. He kissed her, and it was cool and certain and absolute. The way he held things, the way he held positions and codes and words given, without room for doubt. And she kissed him back with the warmth and precision of someone who has weighed the evidence and made the call. When he pulled back, he looked at her with silver eyes that were entirely, completely unguarded, and she thought that might this be the rarest thing she had seen in the entire 3 weeks, rarer than the council vote, and rarer than Solvain's face when the detention came, because this was Hadrian Ivoryn with nothing behind his eyes but what was actually there. There is something I should tell you, he said. More complications, she said. An option, he said. Not a pressure. There is a process. In vampire tradition called the companion accord, it is old, older than the blood oaths. It is not turning, it is not transformation. It is a formal recognition, witnessed by the court, that a chosen person shares in the protection and standing of the Duke's house, with a measure of extended longevity tied to the court's own continuity. He watched her face carefully. It does not make you a vampire. You would remain human in every meaningful sense, but you would not age the way an unbound human ages. You would have the court's full legal standing in great house proceedings, and you would be formally under my protection, not by oath, by bond. A different kind entirely. She was quiet for a moment. How long has that option existed? Since the founding of the great houses, it has been used rarely. It requires the head of a house to make the declaration formally and publicly, which is not a small thing. Have you ever considered it before? No, he said simply. She considered him. You're telling me this so I can refuse it freely? Yes, and if I accepted it, then you would have. Insofar as I am able to give it to you time, he said. Not infinite time, but considerably more than you would have otherwise. Enough for this to be something real and long, rather than something real and brief. She thought about 2 years of running. She thought about the forensic decision-making that had brought her to his court in the first place. She thought about his hands on her face and his voice in the corridor. You will always have help now. And the way he had not left when he could have, not once, not when it would have been easier and safer and politically more straightforward. I want to think about it, she said, not because I'm uncertain, because you brought me a decision that deserves real consideration, and you deserve my consideration of it rather than a reflexive answer. Of course, he said. Ask me again in a week, she said. He nodded. He touched her face once more, briefly, and then straightened, and the control came back, but it was a different control from before, less armored and more chosen, and she could see the difference. Dinner? He said. Yes, she said. She thought about it for a week. She thought about it the way she thought about everything, thoroughly and without flinching from the uncomfortable parts. The uncomfortable parts included: she was human and he was not. The court of Ivoryn had twice harbored people willing to sell her out. Vampire politics were not ever going to be simple or safe, and choosing to extend her life through a vampire court's bond was an extraordinary commitment to a relationship that was barely a month old. She also thought about the parts that were not uncomfortable, which included that he had come for her when he did not have to, that his word was worth more than most institutions she had worked with, that the Northern Court's century-spanning record of ethical conduct was verifiable in ways she had personally verified, that she had spent 2 years making every decision alone, and the weight of that had been real, and she had not known quite how real until it was not there anymore. On the 8th day, she went to find him. He was in the records room reviewing documents from the council restructuring, because the governance work did not stop simply because the crisis had. He looked up when she came in. "Ask me," she said. He rose from his chair. "Adeline Dumont," he said, and his voice was formal in a way it had not been before, the old-world formality of someone invoking something ancient and real. "I ask whether you will accept the companion accord of the House of Ivoryn, freely given, freely received, without condition or obligation of return." "Yes," she said, "I accept." The warmth that moved through his expression was like watching something very old and very guarded finally decide that the risk was worth it. The formal declaration was made 3 days later in the main hall of the Chicago holding, before the assembled court. There were 26 Northern Court members present, and the archivist spoke the old words. And Hadrian stood in front of everyone he led and said aloud that Adeline Dumont was companion of his house, and of his personal protection and of his choice. And she stood beside him and held his hand, and it was the most extraordinary and most ordinary moment of her life simultaneously. Afterward, the copper-haired archivist pressed her hand warmly and said, "You saved this house, you know. Not just the oath. The heart of it." He had been very alone for a very long time. "I know," Adeline said, and looked across the room to where Hadrian was in a measured conversation with 2 court members, but was watching her over their heads with those silver eyes. "So had I." The months that followed were not simple. Simplicity was never going to be on offer for the companion of the Duke of the Northern Court. The council restructuring created new political adjacencies that required constant attention. The dissolution of the Solvane House produced a power vacuum in the Eastern Territories that 3 smaller houses immediately began competing to fill, which created a new set of negotiations. And the question of how a human consultant with a background in financial forensics fit into vampire court operations was one that had no prior template and needed to be built from scratch. She built it. She spent 3 months designing a monitoring function for the council, a permanent audit mechanism that would require all Great House financial operations to submit to oversight by a standing panel that included both vampire court representatives and human regulatory equivalents. It took 6 rounds of negotiation and considerable political capital, and Hadrian sat beside her in every meeting and said nothing unless she needed support, and said everything she needed when she did. The mechanism passed. It was not perfect. Nothing in governance is ever perfect, but it was better than what had existed before, and Adeline had learned long ago that better than before is what you actually achieve, and everything else is aspiration. She kept her apartment, the one she rented in Chicago's North Side, which she had moved into after the Solvane process was resolved. She did not live in the underground holding permanently, though she kept a room there and used it regularly. She liked having a space that was hers, that had her books and her particular coffee-making process, and her window that faced east so she could watch the sunrise on the mornings when she woke early, which was most mornings. Hadrian spent 3 nights a week at her apartment. This was not announced or formalized. It simply happened, the way things happen between 2 people who have stopped working against their own preferences. He came after dark, which was always, and sat in her armchair while she read or worked, and sometimes they talked and sometimes they did not, and both the talking and the not talking were comfortable. He learned where she kept the coffee because he made it for her. She learned where he kept the old books he preferred because she read 2 of them when he left them and had opinions about both. He found her opinions worth having, which she had known he would, but which still mattered. One evening, 8 months after the night the blood oath broke, she looked up from the council audit report she was annotating to find him watching her with that particular expression, the entirely unguarded one she had only ever seen when he was not working to maintain anything. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Only that you are the most interesting thing that has happened to me in a very long time." "I brought down a great house," she said. "That's objectively interesting." "Before that," he said, "the night I came for you, you swung your elbow at my throat." She had forgotten she told him that was what she had attempted. It seemed like the right move. "No human has ever attempted to physically assault me on first meeting," he said with the dry quality that was his version of humor, "in 400 years. 400 years is a long time to go without someone setting expectations," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "I love you," he said, and it was the same office he used for everything, the same controlled precision, but it was not controlled at all. She put the report down. She looked at him, this 400-year-old vampire lord, in her armchair in her North Side apartment, white-haired and silver-eyed and impossibly present. "I love you," she said, simply, like fact, because it was. He crossed the room to her, and she rose from the couch, and, when he kissed her this time, it was not the careful precision of the first time, but something fuller and warmer that had 400 years on one side and 28 years on the other, and met exactly in the middle, which was, she thought, the best place for anything to meet. Outside, Chicago was doing its relentless city thing. Cars and light and the vast human and inhuman machinery of a world that contained both vampires and forensic analysts and underground courts and blood oaths and terrible betrayal and the particular stubborn persistence of people who refuse to look away from what they have found. She had not looked away. He had come at midnight with 11 minutes to spare, and here they were. On the 1-year anniversary of the night the oath broke, she took a personal day from the council audit work, and he arranged for the night, and they drove out of the city to a property in the northern hills that the Ivoryn court had held for decades, a house that was above ground for once, with wide windows and old wood floors and a garden that was November bare but had the bone structure of something beautiful. He walked the garden with her in the dark, which was his time, the hours when he was most completely himself, unhurried and at ease, and the stars were very clear above the bare trees. "This was where I came when I needed to think," he said, about the house, when the court was very loud and the decisions were very heavy. "And now?" "Now I want to share it," he said, "if you want it." She looked at the house with its wide windows and thought about the apartment which she loved, and thought about both things being true simultaneously, which they were. "I want it," she said. He took her hand, and they stood in the garden under the stars, which required nothing of them except to be there. And it was, she thought, the finest version of rest she had ever experienced. The companion accord continued to do what it had promised. She did not age the way a fully unbound human would, though she remained herself, warm-skinned and alive in all the human ways. The court accepted her over time, not all of them easily and not all of them quickly, but genuinely, because she had proven herself not through the court's metrics but through her own, and the court's metrics had, gradually, shifted to include hers. The council monitoring mechanism she had designed ran its first full cycle of audits 18 months after implementation and caught 2 emerging irregularities in small house operations that were resolved before they became the next Solvane. She received a formal acknowledgement from the council chair, which she accepted with the particular satisfaction of watching something she had built work the way she had designed it. She called it preventative architecture, which made Hadrian look at her with that entirely unregarded expression. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said for the second time in this habit of his. "Only that you built a system to prevent the very thing that brought you to me." "And," she said. "And I find myself considerably ambivalent about preventative architecture," he said, "in the specific context of the series of events that resulted in this." She laughed. He watched her laugh with the expression she had decided she would never fully get used to, not because she feared it, but because some things should stay remarkable. She kept them remarkable. "Don't worry," she said. "The architecture isn't retroactive." "Good," he said, later, in the house above the garden with the November stars now concealed behind early snow clouds. She sat across from him at the old wooden table where he had apparently sat alone for decades, thinking through impossible decisions. And she thought about the oath that had broken, and the 14-minute warning, and the cold grip of an iron-sure hand on her wrist in a rain-wet alley. And she thought that sometimes the thing that unmakes your safety is the same thing that leads you to the only safety that is actually real. She had been running for 2 years. She had found, at the end of all that running, not a destination so much as a person who was worth stopping for, which was, she thought, the better version of arrival. The blood oath had broken. She had become the Northern Duke's last hope, which was the story the council told about the Solvane dissolution in its formal records, the human forensic analyst who carried an empire's worth of evidence in her memory and walked it into the High Council chamber and changed the shape of great house politics entirely. But that was not, she thought, quite the full story. The full story was that Hadrian Ivoryn had come for her at midnight and had not let go, not of his word and not of his choice. And she had chosen him back with the same fullness that she brought to every decision, completely and based on evidence and without reservation, and that they had built something together out of the wreckage of betrayal and broken oaths that was considerably more durable than a binding administered by a court steward in the old tongue. The snow began to fall outside the wide windows. He poured her a glass of the particular wine she had discovered she preferred and set it beside her without being asked, as he always did. And she picked it up and looked at him across the table and thought that love is not a thing you fall into, but a thing you build, steadily and with care, from trust and protection and honest words and the willingness to stay in the room when staying is harder than leaving. She had stayed, so had he. And the snow fell over the garden, and the stars were behind the clouds, and the house was warm, and the northern court held, and Adeline Dumont, who had once run for her life down an alley in Chicago, sat at a table with the man who had found her there, and was, for the first time in a very long time, and for all the time that came after, entirely at rest.